Hola, hola. Súper. Bueno, buenas noches. Vamos a darle inicio a la conferencia de hoy en este ciclo del taller de invierno llamado Primos y Amigos. Hoy vamos a recibir a Jacob Höppner de Alemania, quien va a estar presentando su trabajo. Y mañana tendremos la última conferencia y cierre del taller por parte de Thomas Padmanabhan, de Lütjens Padmanabhan Architekt de Zúrich, Suiza. Un poco como comentábamos hace un rato en el taller, el cronograma para mañana va a ser tener una puesta en común entre profesores y estudiantes a las 4 de la tarde, exhibiendo los trabajos y cada uno presentándolos. A partir de las 6 de la tarde va a estar habilitada la exhibición en el taller para que inviten a familiares, amigos, colegas y demás. Luego tendremos la conferencia de Thomas, que va a ser en la SB 203. Y para terminar va a haber un brindis en el taller. Así que mañana tenemos un programa completito. Bueno, un poco ya presenté el resto del calendario del CEAC ayer, simplemente, bueno, para hacer el comentario que más nos surge, la próxima semana vamos a recibir a Luis Rojo, un arquitecto, crítico y académico español. Va a estar dando una conferencia titulada La arquitectura también se escribe, que es el título de su último libro. Eso va a ser el jueves próximo a las 19 y ahí volvemos a nuestra programación habitual de tener una conferencia todos los jueves a las 7. Bueno, me gustaría presentar a Jacob formalmente. Jacob Höppner is an architect by the University of Stuttgart. He founded his practice last year, and before doing so, he worked in Carmody Groake Architects in London, and he worked in Zurich with Lütjens Padmanabhan, leading residential projects in the UK, Switzerland, and Germany. He has been a teacher at Porto Academy, a teacher in the University of Stuttgart, and also in Yale Architecture School. And now he's a visiting teacher in the studio led by Oliver Lütjens and Thomas Padmanabhan at ETH in Zurich. So Jacob came as a part of this great team that we have for the workshop led by Thomas. So I'd like to invite him to tell us a little bit about their relationship and his thoughts on his work. So please, Thomas.
Over the last 4 days, you have all met Jacob and known him, so we don't really need to introduce him. But I have to repeat, Jacob, that I'm so grateful that you decided to join us on this trip here to Buenos Aires and to join us in this great experience of meeting all of you and teaching all of you. It's been great so far. Architecture is a slow profession, just like plants, where you put a seed into the ground. A plant slowly starts to grow, and the most exciting moment to witness are the first stages, when in a small scale the first ideas seem to appear, and when on a very small scale maybe seemingly unimportant details are found, invented, and designed. But let me be clear, these things can be the beginning of something much larger. And this is an important thing to look at for you, for your own future. If you are a young architect and you get a very humble, seemingly humble job to do, something very small. In this small job, you can discover the entire world. for you, and then it will carry you further. And maybe if you get the chance, that world is going to expand in size, no? And you can it's going to grow like a plant. And I think let's look closely at what kind of plant, beautiful plant, Jacob's going to present to us tonight.
Thank you. I think that's fine, but you're okay. Yeah. Something seemed to have slipped here, but first of all, thank you all for coming. It's a huge privilege to give a lecture here, and I want to thank everyone who made this possible, especially Thomas, and also thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Javier and Thomas together. I want to show 3 projects that deal both implicitly and explicitly with the theme of transformation. One is a literal translation for an apartment. The other is a metaphoric transformation of an object. And the third is a research project that deals with the transformation of architectural ideas. I want to show to you what I'm interested in and also want to share the process of how I work. So don't expect any large finished buildings. Like Thomas also said in the introduction, I only just started my practice end of last year. So in Kohlhaas's terms of SML, XL, we are talking SXS and XSS, like super, super tiny one. But we're gonna go there anyway. Richard Serra apparently said that there's a difference between size and scale. Scale is something one can measure, but size has to do with presence. I'm interested in transformations as the productive shifts that can achieve that it can achieve this presence. And I had to think of David Byrne, the frontman of the post-punk band Talking Heads, and his iconic performance in the movie Stop Making Sense, where over the course of the concert his suit would get bigger and bigger until he finished in this, as one newspaper described it, mammoth piece of tailoring. And what I love about this performance is this act of transforming something that we know into something that we don't really understand, and something that even though one can probably measure the size of this suit, transforms the appearance and character completely. As architects, we are transformers as well. Like Cindy Sherman in her portraits, we are constantly changing into different roles, spanning from artists, activists, politicians, to builders, developers, or lawyers. And this is even just describing a historic and probably outdated definition of the role of an architect. We are already the second generation after Lyotard's End of the Grand Narrative, this divide into as many worlds as people on Earth that doesn't really have to deal with a rupture, but instead acts within a continuous present. This present includes both the past and the future, and allows us as architects to transform all things that surround us equally and simultaneously. We no longer live in a world in which the single artistic genius is the status quo, or expanding the built environment is an innocent activity. With everything we do, we change our environment. I therefore believe that it is important to recognize authorship in whatever group size one is working in, whether one person or an office or a collective. And that being an author always implies that a project of whatever size reflects, negotiates, and represents one's own viewpoints, be it aesthetical, environmental, or social characteristics. And I think that we should embrace this as a huge potential. I believe that we as architects have to take decisions and that we need to take responsibility for our actions in an emphatic and enjoyable way. And it was so great to see all of you today present your work, because I had the feeling that that already happened. You spoke about it in such a positive way. It was really great to see. So I want to start with an emphatic and enjoyable project as well. This is a collaborative project I did this summer with 3 colleagues from ETH Zurich, Steffen Hegele, Matthew Phillips, and Nelly Pilz. The ETH is placed on the Hönker Berg. Here you can see the main architecture faculty building in the front in brown over there, in the foreground. on this postcard, no mountains, but with less clouds. Usually you can also see the Alps in the background. The project started with an emergency rescue action. Since the 70s, the outdoor furniture of the architecture department at ETH consists of these chunky timber benches here in front, and at the cafeteria, brown metal tables, which I think in this archive photo you somehow see in the back. There they are. They are extremely sturdy, simple, and elegant. A while ago, these have been slowly replaced by heavy, immovable concrete furniture. This has, of course, caused an outrage amongst the students and staff, not only for aesthetic reasons, but also because of the historic and immaterial value people gave to these objects. So the nostalgic one said that Peter Merkley and others probably finished off their cigarettes on these tables. And there was a story to every chewing gum stuck on it. Me didn't study at ETH, obviously didn't have those feelings, but anyway. So when we heard that these completely intact tables were temporarily stored in the parking garage of the university and about to be thrown away, we tried to rescue them. We negotiated with the ETH department to store the tables for another month to give us time to find another place and use for them, but they were not very cooperative. I guess the bureaucratic hurdles are one of the truly universal things of democratic societies. So the tables had to leave the ETH premises by the end of the week, and we couldn't do anything about it. So often in projects, coincidence defines the next step of a process. So every day I'm arriving at ETH, I'm walking by the GTA exhibitions, a space that is part of the Institute of History and Theory of Architecture and is directed by the art curators Fredi Fischli and Niels Olsen. Fischli he's actually the son of the artist you had the art piece by. The space is used for exhibitions on art and architecture, such as the recent exhibitions on the work of Swiss architect Theo Hotz, or the exhibition Performing Colonial Toxicity by Samir Henny. The most recent exhibition was on the work of the American artist Beverly Buchanan, entitled I Broke the House. Buchanan is an artist from North Carolina that explored Southern vernacular architecture through her practice. She created these amazing series of makeshift sculptures known as shacks, in which she pays tribute to the improvised and self-built homes of Black communities in rural Georgia. Her work is amazing. It's really worth checking out. Here we have a photo of the space, so you get a feel for that. We mentioned Duchamp during the presentation of Cousins and Friends and also talked about it in the last couple of days a lot. The transformation of an everyday object into something else, the value of things and the creation of value and the ability to look at things with different eyes. We found out that the exhibition space is unused for a month between dismantling and setting up 2 exhibitions and negotiated with Niels and Fredi to store the tables in there. I could immediately understand Duchamp. I was absolutely fascinated with the form of these tables, the screen-like character of the top and the strange transformation into this transparent wall sculpture somehow when we stacked them sideways. The fact is, of course, that they are not built to be stacked sideways, so we constantly had to negotiate with one of the very basic architectural issues, gravity, that made the physicality of these objects both visible and audible. It was extremely loud when they fell down, and there were constantly people coming into the space and looking what we were doing. We got interested in the material properties of these industrial elements, and especially with the forms that were composed through these effects of tectonic failure. And I couldn't stop taking photos. I was extremely fascinated by the density of these table screens and how this installation dealt with the uncontrollable within the confines of this exhibition space. And also the new tectonic balance they found in some cases. What appears chaotic at first is accessible to the eye as order from matter, from reality. The funny thing is that the transformation of the tables to something else did not only happen in an artistic, but also in a practical and bureaucratic sense. So since the tables were now categorized as art, we were able to keep them on the ETH premises for a bit longer. Our aim was to make everything aware that these tables exist, bring people together to discuss about these topics of reuse and the life cycle of objects, and finally to launch an open call for the future life of the tables. So one iteration was already the transformation into this art installation. The next was open for others to suggest what these tables might be. The smallest project Jean Nouvel ever did was also a transformation of an everyday object, which he proposed for an organized competition in a, how he described it, somewhat historicist and nostalgic spirit. And in context of this project, he paraphrased Jorge Luis Borges, probably didn't pronounce him well, but for that fact alone, I thought I have to include it tonight, in saying, I make architecture as serious as a child who plays. And I love this quote because it combines the aspect of seriousness and fun, which way too often is ignored by architects, where things are either fun or serious. With the same seriousness and fun, we used the visibility of the GTA exhibition space and invited the entire faculty, staff, and friends for an exhibition finissage of the art installation. We wrote an exhibition description, copied the layout, and advertised this on all platforms. We quite liked the idea that we invite for a finissage without ever having a vernissage. And I received a lot of messages from colleagues asking how they could have missed this and so on. It was quite impressive. We then had a wonderful evening of discussions and launched this open call. So now everyone can submit a proposal of what should happen with these tables in the future. Also, if you have any idea for a reincarnation plan for these objects as well, let me know. To me, this project was interesting on many levels, but particularly for this transformative and subversive approach and the possibility of discussing architectural issues through different media. And this is also why I understand architecture as a discipline and not as a profession. It defines itself against what has been considered as architecture so far, only in opening up its forms in media. And I mean, very historically, this was drawing and text. And through that, it established itself as a discipline, and therein it is artistic. So when talking about transformation of a discipline, one has also to talk about the transformation of ideas. And I want to show a research project on the work of the British architect James Stirling that I'm undertaking at the moment. But I have to say that I'm a huge fan, so research is probably not the right word, and take this into account when looking at the next couple of slides. I have a fascination for his architecture since my studies in Stuttgart, the hometown to one of his greatest buildings, which you can see here, the Staatsgalerie. There has been numerous research and text on the collaborations between him, James Gowan, and later Michael Wilford. But for the simplicity of this presentation, I will only use the term Stirling's work as a phrase, of course, acknowledging the work of his numerous collaborators and partners as well. What I'm most interested in Stirling's work is the idea of architecture as a transformative shift. Similar to the tables and also to David Byrne's gigantic suit, in Stirling's work, architectural elements are transformed to objects of formal value in defining overall space, full of ambiguity, surprise, energy, and fun. Raphael Moneo also referred to the provocation that lies in this act, and I agree with his view that Stirling probably enjoyed that aspect as well. He always works with something that is recognizable, that gets transformed into something else, and has seemingly a thing for overscaled handrails. Before we saw the one in Staatsgalerie, he also did it at Leicester, and as you can see here at the Flory building in Oxford. There's a double play at play, so it's always object versus functional element, but at the same time, the buildings always maintains the unity of a project, an inner coherence that holds things together. A fantastic example of this is the college extension to the Oxford University. His proposal has all core components of the university college type, the courtyard, the tower, the cloister, but at the same time, each element has a highly revised form, is broken and transformed into these fantastic hybrids. In this case, something between courtyard, cloister, and landed spaceship, highly accumulated with elements and images. To me, this is architecture at its highest level, the ability to completely transform a type without falling into the trap of playing, still full of determination, extremely expressive and fresh. At least fresh at that time. I also love the absorption of images in his work. the densification and overlays of different associations, and share his fascination for the dark and uncanny. The Canadian Centre for Architecture has a vast amount of his archive, where one can find copies of Hawksmoor churches, photographs taken by him of Inca stonework in Peru, as well as numerous details of the docks in Liverpool. His work is full of clear gestures, full of presence and physicality, even in the less prominent parts, such as the administrative building in Stuttgart at the back of the Staatsgalerie. He is obsessed with plasticity, which he also uses frequently as a complement on other architects' work in his notebooks. And one can find beautiful details of this in all kinds of materials. These are examples of Stuttgart again, but it is clearly visible in earlier projects as well, such as the Olivetti Training School. When I moved to Zurich, my interest in his work was faced with a culture in which his influence wasn't as clearly traceable as in Stuttgart and London, where I was before. For Switzerland, at least the German-speaking part, Aldo Rossi, Robert Venturi, and Denise Scott-Brown seem to have been by far the more influential architects of the 60s and 70s. The influence of Aldo Rossi's ETH teaching activities have already been sufficiently documented. He taught for 2 years as a guest professor at ETH, even though a lot of people say that his influence, for example, on Herzog de Meuron, has been over-exaggerated in the academic research and writings on it. In the case of Venturi Scott-Brown, this was due to the American interest of the Archithese, an architectural magazine in Switzerland, and their founder, Stanislaus von Moos, who was or is a big admirer of and supporter of their work. Traces of Stirling are a competition win for a gallery in Lugano in the 80s, which was never realized, and a visit by Stirling for a shared exhibition with Ungers at ETH, which seems to have been documented in the ETH archive mainly through a letter suggesting his interest in the Switzerland garden gnomes. There has been an international revision of Stirling's work around 2005 and then through the peak in 2013, including a great book by Amanda Rees-Lawrence that looks at his work as revisionary modernistic. But there hasn't been a real examination of the work of the practice in the light of contemporary discourses. Instead of the transformations in his work, I'm interested in the transformation of his work and also think that there are interesting links to contemporary Swiss tendencies. I'm currently in the process of organizing a Stirling symposium in Zurich to explore this further, especially his influence on Swiss architecture and to gather new perspectives on his work, focusing on a revision under the themes of climate change, performance, and risk, beyond the fascination of his popular axonometric drawings. So the last project I want to show is a transformation of an apartment, or rather several transformations to an apartment in Berlin. The project will be finished in September. I therefore won't be able to show any finished photos just yet, but I want to show you the design process in detail and explain how the thoughts and adaptations of the apartment developed and transformed over time. I have to give a trigger warning. It might get a bit nerdy in the middle part when I will explain the different iterations of the process, but I will show a lot of images and hope that you will be able to fully immerse in this fantastic feeling of a design process when all of the things that surround you fight for a place in a project, but yeah, maybe haven't been there yet, but then at some point they are. I will quickly give you a bit of context of where we are situated and then talk about my entry point to the project. We are in the southwest of Berlin in Winterfeldstraße, which is part of the Schöneberg neighborhood. In the 1980s, there were a lot of people living illegally, which resulted in these police squads clearing out spaces and clashing with squatters. Schöneberg is quite young as a neighborhood and was only built during the industrialization. The whole neighborhood was an officers' quarter with upscale living standards, the very rich on the bel etage and main entrances decorated in a stately manner. The building stock is characterized by a high degree of systematization at that time, So once the house was finished, one could choose which style should be put on the facade. Historicism, neoclassicism, could basically just choose. The apartment is part of a building from 1905 and follows the typical Berlin model. So you have the high society in the front, the so-called Berlin room here in the corner, which was usually used as a library or similar, and then the servants in the back. Until 1938, all of this was one flat. So let me show you. All of this was one flat. And then, usually connected with large doors between the main rooms in the front. And then in preparation for the war under Hitler, the large flats were divided to smaller ones. So you see the closed connection at the end of the corridor. Even though the building wasn't directly hit during the World War II, the building was still damaged through the blast waves of the bombs in the area. A new facade was added in the 1950s, but the traces of war, such as the wavy parquet flooring and bent walls in the rear flat, were in parts still visible when the father of my client bought this apartment in the 80s. On Tuesday, we've seen a fantastic lecture by Ricardo, who talked about the modernist urban plan of the Avenida 9 de Julio and this clear, almost land art like wipe out and destruction of blocks to create the avenue. I added these historic slides or historic aerial photographs to give you a bit of context of the randomness of destruction during World War II. This is a photo from 1928. The apartment is where the green circle is before the war. And then here we can see the photo from 1953. It is shocking to see how much damage there was, and it's still visible today. And it still shaped or shapes the urban fabric of Berlin. Since then, the apartment has been further densified and also got a friendly neighboring building at Winterfeldplatz, built by Inken and Hinrich Baller, which you can see here, the spiky funny one at the corner, who are these long ignored Berlin architects that found incredible generosity in the restrictions of social housing between the late 60s and 90s. They have designed unique spatial situations by interweaving indoor and outdoor space and found great expressive freedom within very tight constraints. When I was looking at the slide earlier, I thought, why do I even show this to you? Because it's so, in Buenos Aires at least, you have so many places with the same quality, but in Berlin it's really something special somehow. What I found interesting and relevant about their work or about them to this project is that they understood every existing structure as a resource, be it pre-existing built structures, the social fabric, or flora and fauna, which again comes back to this idea of transformation, and in this case, the building that transforms to landscape. In the case of my client, the existing resource was a non-physical one. When I first met him to talk about the project, he told me that he is about to move back into the apartment where he grew up in as a child. He wanted me to design a new kitchen to make this apartment his own again. He had the feeling that he needed a change of some kind, something fresh to remove the ghosts and to a certain extent override the history of the apartment, including the recent past when his mother was taken care of in these rooms before she sadly passed away. This is the existing floor plan of the apartment. There are 2 bedrooms and a bathroom on the north facade and 2 large rooms facing south. The existing kitchen is placed in the corner of the room with a large bay window, and you can also see the dead end of the corridor, the result of the historic war preparations. What I found extremely interesting were the psychological aspects of this situation. The act of returning to a place of your childhood, this almost ghost-like moment and these invisible and visible traces of the past, as shown in this apartment project by SITE. SITE is an abbreviation that stands for Sculpture in the Environment. They are this funny and provocative architecture group from New York. James Wines actually studied to be a conventional modernist influenced sculptor and only later moved away to question the fundamental premises of prevailing art forms and understanding the process as the result. I also got interested in the process of memory and the fact that memory is always a fragment. We often remember things differently than how they actually occurred, sometimes bigger and sometimes smaller than they actually are. There's this fantastic movie called Memento, where the main character lost his short-term memory and tattoos all the facts he learns about the criminal case he's entangled in onto his body. The entire movie reversed the common way of telling a narrative. It starts with the end and progresses to the beginning of the case. This reverse starting point also interested me in an architectural sense. So often in housing, we design spaces or apartments for people without knowing anything about the future inhabitants. Of course, this is a benefit or opportunity when one works for an individual client, and I decided to embrace this possibility of specificity as best as possible. Robert Harbison also describes this paradox in his book Eccentric Spaces, where he explores the often weird and mysterious spaces that we build for us as humans. He states that if one takes architecture as the expression of an individual life, one has to start as a center. Also, Walter Benjamin discovered strong connections to the spaces around him. In his text Mummerelend, from his book about his childhood in Berlin around 1900, he commented on the fundamental similarities between his ego and the things that surround him, even with his flat and interior. The gift of recognizing similarities is nothing but a weak remnant of the old compulsion to become and behave like others. I, however, am distorted by similarities with everything around me. The alignment with what surrounds Benjamin and, in a broader sense, the merging with the self-created art are equally themes in literature and the visual arts, but they can also be found in architecture. The Soane House in London is a prime example for this phenomenon of equation of people with the houses, in which the architecture is as eccentric as its host. In case you haven't been and you have the chance to go, this house is worth seeing. Soane combined three townhouses to one big conglomerate of spaces, and one gets immediately lost, and the project is full of small gestures, weird situations. It's fantastic. In times of the self, the equation of people with the houses is connected to the question of design. The Berlin-born philosopher, art critic, and media theorist Boris Greuß illustrates this obligation to self-design. Now, however, it is a matter of self-manifestation, self-design, and self-positioning in the aesthetic field, since the subject of such self-contemplation clearly has a vital interest in the image he or she offers to the outside world. In his day, Beuys said that everyone had the right to see him or herself as an artist. What was then understood as a right has now become an obligation. In the meantime, we have been condemned to being the designers of ourselves. This poses a question of where this leaves us as architects, at least in the case of a direct commission or a direct client, and brings us back to Cindy Sherman's portraits. We talked a lot about Buenos Aires having the highest amount of psychoanalysts, and I guess that's more often than not, we will also transform into this role as well. David Cronenberg proclaimed in his movie Crimes of the Future that body is reality, and we could, for the entry point of this project, speculate that architecture as body is reality. What we have at hand is a project with a client who is very much connected to the space, which is full of memories of his childhood and recent past, and a client who sees the apartment and its changes as an extension to the self. I got very interested in a direct translation of this theme of distortion of memory and the deformation that Benjamin observed in his connection to the objects around him. I looked at the architecture of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, these long elongated bay windows at the Glasgow School of Architecture, and also his furniture design with these ridiculously tall backrests. Mackintosh also interested me with regards to the richness of interiors. This is a detail of his paneling for a tea room. It's a tiny photograph in one of his publications, but it was quite present throughout the process for the project. I love this layering of planes, the abstract, almost two-dimensional planes, and the faces that appear when looking at it for a bit too long. Since the apartment is almost 4-meter floor to ceiling height, I was interested in the exaggeration of this verticality and looked at Gothic columns. Gothic also because it brought this dark side that was also explored in literature around the end of the 18th century. It touches on the uncanny and the human psyche. But this photo also talks about a contrast in scale. I also looked at Toyo Ito's distortions of vertical elements and these insertion of a space within a space. Both Mackintosh and Ito are masters of distortion and manipulation of form. Ito even chooses Mackintosh's furniture for his photography. I also like how light is used in these photographs as hard-cutting figures on walls and floors, and how the shadows of the kids are bigger than human and ghost-like. And also, you don't even have a sense for the proportional scale of these spaces. All of these images were quite present in the beginning when I started to work on the project. In the very first attempt, I tried to translate these structures into vertical figures that evoke an idea of volumetric relicts and different furnitures. Almost like ready-mades, too big for the space, they stand in the corner, not touching the ceiling, but somehow way too big. Again, this is the existing floor plan, in which the existing kitchen is simply placed along the wall with no relation to the entrance. The dotted lines are mezzanine structures that the father of the client built in, also an architect, by the way, built in the apartment in the 1980s, in a weird way inspired by the Ballas, I guess. And this was a first test in plan. So what I tried to achieve in plan was an elongated and new approach to the kitchen space. I liked the densification and tension between the inbuilt elements before opening up to the kitchen space. I also tried to bring the shapes of the new kitchen in a relation across the corridor to this weird 45-degree angled wall. I felt it was very dominant and needed a counterbalance in plan. In the end, I felt that the minimal use of intervention in the kitchen space is not powerful enough to have an impact on the entire apartment, which I felt was necessary in order to somehow change the character fully. So I realized that the kitchen as an object needed more presence and tried to make the new additions visible in the both neighboring spaces, the corridor and the living room. What I tried to achieve is a connection between all rooms and a visible intrusion of the kitchen in the living room and corridor to announce a change. The angle in relation to the remnant corridor spaces create a storage space in the deepest part of the plan, which was also useful. This then evolved in putting all elements on one axis to emphasize the relationship to this corridor angle. I also started to detach the fridge from the kitchen to have two simple volumes, so one horizontal one, one vertical one, and to treat them as singular objects. I was still fascinated by the idea of these overscaled and tall, somehow Gothic elements. At some point, there was also a ready-made of an overscaled Mackintosh bay window in the corner of the space, and also a first attempt to defamiliarize such a technical element as a kitchen extract into this somehow cloud figure. So very similar to the way that you work with models so far. I further tried to break these forms, so the direct image of the bay window was gone, and there were also tests where I tried to work with literal cuts as openings in the kitchen fronts. What I've learned from these initial tests was that instead of the object that defines the change, the opening in the wall is a much more important element. The small stair was bridging the heating pipes, so initially I thought we do as little as possible to have a minimal impact on the existing wall, and the long kitchen counter emphasized the verticality in contrast to the opening. From the beginning, I worked with 1 to 50 plans and 1 to 20, this 1 to 20 model, which is now safely stored in this also somehow distorted storage space in my office. And all photos you see are taken from this same model. In the middle of the design process, together as a chair at ETH and together with Thomas and Celine, we went to Barcelona for a seminar week and visited the apartment by Enrique Miralles and Benedetta Tayabue. This project the project that I'm showing here can be divided into a pre and a post Miralles phase, I would say. I have to say that I was absolutely stunned by this apartment. Both architects transformed this apartment step by step, while already living in this space in a quite precarious situation. When we visited, Benedetta Tagliabue was telling us about the birth of her first child in the time of the construction site, but it's really an example of how many different elements, materials, and ideas a project can take. There are these changing floor materials and shapes that define spaces in itself. There's a free use of paint that adds layers to walls and objects. And these subtle manipulations of spatial perception. The angled and curved walls at the end of the living room that they've added, which in a subtle way create spaces on either side and elongate the perspective. So this wall here and the wall here. And also when we met Benedetta Tagliabue and asked her how she did this or how she designed this, she was just laughing and said, "Oh no, it was just a sketch this size. It was just immediately designed in the space while they were living there." So yeah, I was completely stunned by the richness of this project. So when I came back, I realized a shift towards the form of the existing plan and a new way of seeing the things that were already there. Before, there was a clear distinction between old and new, the proud volume of the kitchen counter. Now I slowly began to extend walls, like here. And the geometry of the volumes got broken, got shaved off and distorted, and there was also a more dynamic plan arrangement, something I was fascinated by both Miralles, Pinhos, Tagliabue, and also Toyo Ito's work. So I maximized the distance of travel through the apartment to make the most of both openings. It was now the very long knife-like element that dominated the plan. There's a mirror at the end of the corridor to create a visual connection to the kitchen. Walls became planes that were stacked on top of one another, assimilating a bit with the existing walls already. And another view from the living room and the attempt to dissolve the kitchen into vertical surfaces and distorted elements. I showed this model photos to the client then, which was also the first time he saw a proposal at all. And one could say that he was surprised and shocked. He only asked for a new kitchen and now got this massive object cutting into all parts of the apartment. What I learned at this point as well was that the apartment was actually still owned by his father, who was very much against breaking through load-bearing walls, which in this case was the corridor wall. So this is, of course, two things I learned here. One is, as an architect, we have to be super agile and super adaptive, or adaptability is important. We need to adapt to new situations very quickly. And the other thing is always find out who's your client first before you do any work. But yeah, got these lessons now. So I tried, instead of proposing this one big gesture, to break it down to smaller elements that can be read as one in plan. And I saw these fragmented ideas very much ingrained in the post-war reality of Berlin on an urban scale as well. So this is also the case in the Wohnbebauung am Luisenplatz by Hans Kolloff, the attempt of a connected figure in a fragmented context and the clash with the existing buildings. From this point onwards, the project became much more about the transformation of the apartment through small gestures. Historical elements that are falsely mimicked, certain elements that are emphatically framed or exaggerated, and the individual figure versus the whole. There are three parts. So there's the corridor, closet, single standing fridge figure, which is this one. And then there's the kitchen space, which is here, and then a movable kitchen trolley, which is this one. The kitchen is put in relation to the opening, and the opening is creating a circular way through the apartment. First of all, it's a simply an opening that wasn't there before. And that means new movements, new light, and new connections. These Berlin housing types are mostly built in the same way. So you have a center loading wall construction, roughly 6 meter distance from the facade, timber floors, and then very thin walls in render and clay in between. And this is something I was faced with as well. So we had an extremely thin, but an extremely tall wall. It was almost 4 meters. And I was interested in exaggerating this thinness by proposing an almost surgical incision, cutting the wall in an angle, which follows the direction of the kitchen. So you can see the cuts here and here. These incisions as a direct way of showing a change to a space interested me, and also in a superordinate sense somehow interested the client. The client is a doctor himself, by the way, so throughout the process there were these funny situations where he replied to the transformations I proposed with surgical descriptions, for example, describing to keep as much healthy tissue as possible. And through these conversations, the coldness and precision of these stainless steel surgical objects, such as these stylized images from the movie Dead Ringers, somehow also found their way into the project. Here's a photo of the model at nighttime, where I think one can see this connection somehow. And then, this opening has already been done. There were also these interesting situations where the construction work has already started in the apartment, but at the same time, the client already lives there. So after I also showed him the Miralles photos as some kind of reference, so he knows a bit what I was talking about, he was calling me at sometimes and asking, so is it finished, the project, or not? Because there were construction workers coming and doing things, but then they left, but then they still left stuff. And there were these interesting confusions. So here you can see the physicality of the opening. You can see the wall construction, so it's super thin. It's like 8.5 centimeters, but 4 meters tall. It's almost 100 or 120 years old, this wall. So, and then a view back. These are a couple of finished photos of the situation, and I really wanted to embrace the incremental and the contingent rather than a dogmatic vision of this plan somehow. And I believe that this is also the much more contemporary sensibility we need. And also in combination with a certain precision is somehow radical sensibility, which we need. So in this case, the opening gets a direction, the wall gets this almost passepartout-like edges on the frame, which is also funny because the client has a partner with who already has a son from a previous partner, and this kid is I think 4 now or 5, and he constantly starts running through this apartment now, and this kid said that he's walking faster through this opening now because it has this direction or these angles in the walls, which I really loved. So it's only an opening, but I try to be as precise as possible. So from the one side, one can read it as a wall and as part of the kitchen, and also in relation to the bay window, falsely mimicking the corner situation and lintel height. There's the shadow surfaced only reveals itself when you turn the corner. This is something I find amazing also in the work of Jean Nouvel, these subtle manipulations of perception. For example, in the theater in Lyon, where he paints the inside of the existing columns all black to pretend the stronger shade. You can also see the existing stucco work a bit in the background. They were painted over so often that you can barely see the contours anymore, but I still wanted to contrast this with an extremely sharp geometry. On the other side of the column, it had to do something different. So there's no relation to the corner of the bay window. So the cut is extended to become a pilaster figure that pretends to hold the lintel. And I was also interested in, I showed a couple of film reference somehow, but I'm also interested in a cinematic approach to perceiving space, also as shown on these photos. You have different images of the same situation, but it's something which you really just see when you somehow inhabit the space. This pilaster figure was also necessary for plan graphic terms in order to break this dividing center line between the two rooms. And another element that breaks the center line is a threshold. So what I proposed is to fill in the missing gap on the point of the wall with the same timber in the same direction, and sanding off the old and new together to create this artificial sunbeam as a transition between the two rooms. I also like this idea of what is actually a threshold. Is it just the division between these two rooms, or can it sometimes also be lines which is a shadow or sunlight? And also what I find interesting with working with existing fabric is that sometimes you take things away and instead of adding, you can even bring the things more together. So the opening now offers several positions for this distorted and movable kitchen trolley, which from some perspectives is transparent, and from other views it's completely closed, and it can also just block the way entirely. So it almost this opening almost becomes a window in the space. Through this theme of distortion, I got interested in Robin Evans' book, The Projective Cast, in which he follows the idea of the relationship between geometry and architecture, drawing on mathematics, engineering, and art history to uncover processes in the imagination and realization of architectural form. I was especially interested in the examples of ambiguity of projection that he shows, and the interaction of imagination with projection and its metaphors. In a very basic sense, the contrast of architecture being extremely image-based today, but at the same time, we are still drawing things in plan, elevation, section, in order to get them built. This is where this aspect of movement and dynamism is also coming into play again. I tried to deform these parts of the kitchen itself and was fascinated with the idea of the static element that appears as if it's moving somehow. Everything is made of simple materials with simple manipulations. So you have these dropped shoulders. The staggered wall planes become one with the existing wall, and the individual elements bit by bit get melded together. I was looking for a way to surpass the main expression of the kitchen as a static element with the boxy wall unit at the top and the tiled splashback and the standard module of a kitchen extract. And again, that comes back to this manipulation of a type. So what I tried is to fold these wall planes to make space for the kitchen extract, but at the same time, it's also a light. It mediates, these wall planes mediate between the existing wall and the kitchen counter, and also, try to bring it all together as one composition, as one figure. The stove becomes the lively center of the apartment and is combined with the lamp behind this bright colored glass, as if the stove is constantly burning. This is something where I was thinking of Mirais again, who said when he was designing this table, he said, I'm doing a table, but most of the time it's something different. It's just there. So when one gets a glass of water at night, you now have these things that are just there. These now weirdly overscaled objects, almost like nocturnal animals. You can also see the overscaled fridge. So the door height of the room is 2.40 meters, and the fridge is same height to create this weird twin. And the trolley and the kitchen space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for the wonderful lecture. It is amazing to see this week all together, the love for architecture from you guys. It's really, I think, enriching and inspiring for us, just showing 3 projects, but this amount of books and references and and as Thomas mentioned yesterday, sensibilities towards these pieces. A lot of the perhaps drawings or references are known to us, but what is delightful is to hear your interpretations and your selections on this. I think this is super inspiring, not just for the students to put their work into context, but also for teachers and practitioners as well. So thank you a lot for the generosity in the selection of these documents and references and ideas. Well, now we have some time for questions or comments, if there are any from the audience. Wants to break the ice, perhaps? Well, perhaps Marcelo breaks the ice.
Oh, thank you, Jacob, for the presentation, and I think it's very important for the students of the school to see you how you start your practice, and it's amazing to discover how no matter the scale or no matter the topic, every chance we have to have a vision, a project, or yes, a project. It's an opportunity to reorganize our constellation of interest. That was super clear in your presentation. And what I would like to ask is if you work in that way, because I mean that could be an interesting point of view, at least for me.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely work that way. I mean, I think we as architects, especially when you are young and you start to set up your practice, sometimes you have amazing opportunities of immediately starting with a project, but sometimes you also don't have these opportunities. And I think no matter the scale, the idea can still be extremely valid and can also be translated into different scales later if they might come. And I think we just have to make the most of whatever we are able to do, no? As a starting point of things.
Also, speaking about these references, something that struck me a lot these days, and from your biography and this presentation is that you've lived and worked in many places, and now so you have your office in Zurich, but this last project was in Berlin, and I wanted to know yes, a little bit about this nomadic experience of working. I mean, yeah, if you can share just perhaps a little bit of gossip about this, because yesterday I think that Celine presentation really, and we talked about this, really it had a lot of insight of how it is to found a practice and work in Switzerland, and she showed a variety of competitions and installations and even personal projects in this regard, but you're kind of moving, no? So I wanted, perhaps some thoughts on that.
Sure. I think it goes back a bit to the question of Marcelo. You don't really choose where your first project will be somehow. I think in my case, I knew very early on that I would at some point want to start my own practice, but at the same time, I had no idea what this would mean and how you would ideally go that way. And I also don't think that there's this ideal way of getting there. But obviously, looking at other practices, when you come from a place and you study at this place and you start your practice in this place, your network of social and collaborative connections is quite dense, and this in most cases also helps in setting up a practice. And that's something that you obviously don't have when you move around a lot. But at the same time, for me, after studying, I knew that I would want to leave Germany. I didn't want to work there. I wanted to, because I thought, if you don't go in a foreign country to work straight after uni, you won't do it after a couple of years later. it gets more difficult afterwards. As a tip. So then from London I went to Zurich, and then at some point you're faced with the question, if you want to start your practice, where do you actually do that? And after working in London and then working in Zurich, it was either of the two, because I didn't really know anything or anybody in Germany, never worked there, didn't really know the legal situations there. So then it was Zurich, and now I just try my best there. Let's see.
And now you work in Germany. The two.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
Funny, no? Yeah.
It's like that. One has a wish, and then the opportunities come.
Exactly.
Oh, no.
Someone doing the same.
Thanks, Jakob, for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering, since, I mean, we've kind of experienced it yesterday also, but in many, I don't know, our generation that is just starting, that we are kind of starting in a similar scale, like the extra small and small scale in the furniture. But at the same time, while we are receiving an architectural education, like we're not industrial designers and we are usually not projecting in this scale. But at the same time, then once you are like actually starting your own practice, then you're like thrown into this scale. And I was wondering, maybe what do you take from, or if you remember, if you can think of something you took from architecture school and like your architectural education that maybe facilitates like the confrontation of scales maybe that you have not worked on during university, maybe, like this starting off in a different scale that we might.
I think I don't actually differentiate between these scales so much. I think it's there can be as much architecture in a chair, or there can be more architecture in a chair than in a building done by an architect. I think it's really just about the questions you have on this object, or the work you do on this object. So I don't really differentiate there so much. So.
Yes, I wanted to take something from the start of the talk when you said about being the author of your decisions. I feel like a student, I have this safe space of the school where I feel like really comfortable taking my own decisions. But I wanted to know if you felt like the difference in the step up when you left school and you started like to making real decisions. I think like in constructed buildings, this, how do you say, the responsibility behind them. I think it's something I'm lacking now and I'm quite scared of, you could say. But I think it's something that it will eventually come up. And I think it's, here you see like some audacity in your decisions. It's really interesting, like that difference. I know
Yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah, it's definitely like that. But I think it's still no need for to be afraid of. I think you just grow into being able to take this decision somehow, or maybe even you never really get used to it, and you're still afraid of whether you decided on some things right or not. But yeah, I think it's just part of it. It will grow naturally. I think I mean it more in the sense that I see, or I have the feeling that a lot of people somehow hide behind the things they do if they put a certain type of logic or reason in front, and instead of actually even acknowledging what they are doing. I think it's really important for if you work as an architect, if you design something, that you know what you are designing and what you, and if you acknowledge your decisions, to also be able to communicate them in a direct way to people or to the world.
Super.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a concern about if there's a way of thinking about the moment when the client takes place of your project, because despite all the concept, it's like a really beautiful place. You you did, and if there is a way of thinking when the client comes with those everyday things that you talk about, and how they become part of this place that is like, we call it pulcro. No, I don't know the word in English, sorry. Like really clean. So the appropriation from the client from this space, like the pictures of their family or some kind of art or those common things that take place in your work, if there is a concern about that.
Not at all. Not at all. The contrary, actually. I think it would be really good if life takes these elements over somehow. And he's a client who would definitely do that. He already asked whether he can change certain things about the walls or paintings or something. I think he will do what he wants anyways. And I think it's not a problem. We don't really have control about how people appropriate space, and sometimes it's super nice to see how. Also, even, I mean, who knows? Maybe the door of the cupboard is on the wrong side. No, maybe it's better if it would be on the other side, and then he finds a way around it or he adapts it. I'm not at all concerned about that. Also, because
Great, thank you.
I wanted to ask you, Jacob, something about the second project, the research on Sterling. I think there's a lot of us here and the school and in general, young architects and practitioners who, while they are developing their practice in the more commercial terms, they always have this academic or research interest into a sort of description of a topic in history or particular subject. In this case, it would be your interest in Sterling and seeing why wasn't he seen so much in Switzerland or so on. But at the same time, you're not developing a PhD about it. You're not doing like a historic practice and becoming a historian and so on. You have a practice and you're doing something else. So I wanted to know if you could tell us more about the media specificity of this research. How do you get this going? If it's a book, if it's an exhibition, if it's a redrawing, a little bit how you navigate this landscape.
Yeah. I don't see it so much as this separation between you're either an architect who built or you're an academic who only, let's say, teaches. I'm much more interested in this blend of the two. I'm interested in him as also things to appropriate for myself. But at the same time, I'm also interested in, let's say, in continue to read about architecture and not become this person who only builds somehow. The way that I'm approaching it at the moment is that I interviewed a practice in Switzerland where all three partners were working for Sterling in the 80s.
Cool.
They're called Kreisschart. It was super interesting to talk to them, and they were touching on.
You will have to write this name later.
Yeah, I will.
For us.
Yeah, and it was interesting to talk to them because they also felt this. So they were working for him 70s and 80s. Then they returned to Zurich to start their practice, and they struggled with, let's say, the translation or transformation of these ideas into the Swiss context. And so far, at the moment, the idea is that a symposium could be interesting where all of these different questions could be discussed somehow, because I think at the moment the 90s in Switzerland was a very different time, and I can see why Sterling maybe wasn't the perfect fit, but I see similarities to current tendencies. If you understand Sterling as the beginning of high tech, then you have a very strong connection already, and I would be interested to explore that in a symposium.
It's great. Yeah, it's great to do a little bit of oral history in that way, about interviewing people that work there and so on. Okay, I don't know if there's any other comments or questions. Yes.
Hi.
Really good lecture. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
As a young student, in my second year of the career, I'm interested in. This could also be a question for Celine as well, because in both of your presentations, I really liked, and I thought that it was really interesting, all the like artistic background or the sort of resources that you use to explain your mission as an architect nowadays. And I really like that you use film stills and pieces of art or other things in order to explain your role, your work as an architect.
Mhm.
Thank you. And one thing that our teachers always tell us is that we should do research and we should go to the library and we should yeah, we have things more at hand with the internet, so they always tell us that it's really rich for us to go to a book or to study the work of an architect, of many architects. And so my question is, what sources of information do you use? For instance, this project I think is really interesting, like the angle of this new like passage that you made in this wall, or the position of the countertop of the whole kitchen is really like, it's weird. The first instinct that I had was not to do the kitchen that way. So my question is, where do you get that inspiration from?
I think really from all of the things I've shown, from Macintosh, from Ito, from these body horror movies, from the surgical medical elements or tools somehow. I mean, I think in general, I think I'm interested in really this change of something, or I think I'm looking for something which is somehow unusual. I guess that also helps, that you constantly have an urge. You're not happy with a kitchen just looking like a normal kitchen you could buy from a superstore somewhere. And then I think from there on, it's just a moment where you constantly rework what you do, and then you question whether it's weird enough or far away from what you try to get away from somehow.
Thank you.
Okay, super. So thank you so much, Jacob, and everyone for coming. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.